On her map, a story from the Saltscar universe.
Chapter 1. The iron pin was gone. Kay pressed her palm flat against the cliff edge, where her father's benchmark stone had been set 11 years ago. Granite, hand-chiseled, driven with a surveyor's pin she'd watched him hammer in 3 strikes. She remembered the sound. She remembered the rust on his knuckles. The stone was 20 meters below her now, if it existed at all, swallowed by surf that chewed the rock face into a clean vertical drop the color of wet bone. She crawled back 3 steps on her knees. The ground here was softer, volcanic soil laced with root, not the dense basalt her father had chosen for permanence. She drove the new pin with 6 strikes instead of 3. It seated shallow. Everything seated shallow on this part of Mara now. The council's commission letter sat folded in her belt pouch, sealed with wax she hadn't bothered to break because Lyra had already told her the terms in the kitchen that morning. Hands around a cup she wasn't drinking from. Full coastal survey. Every benchmark, every terrace, every harbor sounding her father had logged before he died, before he was killed. She corrected the thought the way she corrected a measurement, silently, precisely, without looking up. She opened his chart book. The leather was salt-cracked, the pages foxed, but his hand was steady. Coordinates, tide tables, recession lines plotted season by season in ink he'd mixed himself from octopus gall. Station 14, Eastern Escarpment. His final measurement, 17 meters of setback from the original Cataclysm-era wall foundation, dated 10 years ago. She cited her own position against the remaining wall fragment, ran the chain twice, recorded it, 31 meters. 14 meters of cliff face gone in 10 years. The official Maran records, the ones the council kept, the ones visiting Hershey traders glanced at when they assessed port viability, projected 6. She checked his measurement again, checked her own, pulled the chain a 3rd time and watched the numbers refuse to change. The rock beneath her knees hummed, low, subsonic, the kind of vibration that lived in the teeth before the ears caught it. She held still. It faded. Waves, she told herself. The surf was heavy today, but her father's numbers had been ahead of the official records by almost exactly the same margin, as if he'd known, a decade ago, what the island was only now confessing to everyone else. Lyra set the grain ledger on the table like a body on a slab. 6 council members sat around the chamber's basalt oval, 3 elders, 2 terrace overseers, 1 harbor delegate whose chair had been empty for 2 meetings running before today. Rain tapped against the shuttered windows. The room smelled of tallow and damp wool and the vinegar someone had used to scrub mildew from the wall behind the speaker's seat. Eastern Terrace, she said, 3 growing seasons of viable soil, 4 if the autumn rains come heavy and the winter holds mild. She did not look up from her papers. That projection assumes no further cliff loss beyond the current annual rate. The assumption was generous. She knew it. Half the room knew it. Elder Toroth shifted on his bench, the wood groaning under him. "We've heard this." Lyra turned 1 page. Found the 2nd column, the one she'd prepared at midnight, cross-referencing last season's yield against the terrace surveys the Agricultural Committee had been sitting on since planting. She struck a line through the number 3 with her thumbnail, pressing hard enough that the council members nearest her could hear the paper tear. 2 seasons, she said. If we lose the lower terrace shelf this winter, and we will, because the retaining wall has already cracked, 2. She waited. Toroth's jaw worked. The harbor delegate studied his hands. No one corrected her. No one offered an alternative number. The rain filled the silence, and the silence did what argument never could on Mara. It made proud people sit with a truth they could not endure and could not deny. "The survey," Lyra said, "full coastal assessment, emergency priority. My daughter has the instruments and the charts." Toroth nodded once. The overseers followed. "Authorization by exhaustion, the Maran way." Lyra gathered her papers, squared their edges against the table, and walked toward the door. She was almost through it when Peller, youngest on the council, appointed after his father's fishing boat went down in the spring storms, spoke to the back of her head. "Has Hirsch been contacted?" Lyra's hand rested on the doorframe. She did not turn. The room behind her went so quiet she could hear Toroth breathing through his nose. could hear the harbor delegate's boots scrape the stone floor as he shifted his weight away from the question. She stepped through and pulled the door shut behind her. The southern headlands ate her father's coastline whole. 3 days Kay worked the stations alone, transit rod braced against wind that smelled of sulfur and salt, chain stretched taut between iron pins she drove into ground that accepted them too easily. Soft. The rock here should have resisted. It crumbled like fired clay left in rain. At each station she unrolled his charts from the leather case, weighting the corners with stones pulled from the talus. The leather still held the shape of his hands, creased where he'd gripped it, worn pale at the clasp. She didn't linger on that. She sighted through the transit, recorded her numbers, and laid them over his. Station 1. His profile showed 40 meters of beach below the headland. She measured 19. The missing 21 meters hadn't been sand. It had been bedrock shelf. Station 2. He'd drawn a cliff face, with vertical hatching, the cartographer's mark for stable formation. She stood where his cliff face should have been and looked down at a talus slope still shedding stone into the surf. Pebbles rolled under her boots. She stepped back. Station 3. Station 4. The same at every point. His world subtracted, hers the remainder. She recorded each discrepancy in her own hand beside his, her ink darker than his faded octopus gall, her numbers always smaller. She started reading his margins more carefully. His shorthand was half familiar. Abbreviations she'd learned watching him work as a girl, contractions of survey terms any Moran cartographer would know. But threaded through the professional notation was something else. A symbol. 2 concentric circles bisected by a vertical line, small enough to miss if you weren't tracing every mark. It appeared at Station 1, Station 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, always paired with a number sequence. Too short for coordinates, wrong format for elevation, no correspondence to any bearing or tide reference she could reconstruct. She copied each instance into her own margins. Faithful transcription. His eccentricity, she told herself. Every surveyor developed private marks. It meant nothing she couldn't ask him about, except she couldn't ask him about anything. At Station 4, the ground hummed beneath her feet, low, subsonic, felt in the bones of her ankles before it reached her ears. She held still, counted, 4 seconds, 5, 7. It stopped at 9, and the silence that followed pressed upward through her boots like the earth holding its breath. The gangplank flexed under his weight. Ves Huron stepped onto Mara's last deep-water dock with the bureau-stamped transit case in his left hand and the letter of introduction in his right, and he did not look up at the volcano. He looked at the dock. 12 mooring points. The bureau's file listed 18. 6 had been sawn clean, not broken, not rotted. Removed deliberately, the timber repurposed. He counted the boats in harbor, 9. The file projected 17 active vessels for an island of this population. He did not write these observations down. Not yet. The numbers lived behind his teeth where they'd keep. The harbor master was a broad woman with salt-cracked hands who took the letter and read it once quickly, then again with her lips shaping each word as though tasting for poison. Coastal Reclamation Bureau. Assessment of viability. Authorized access to council records, port logs, and agricultural surveys. She looked at him the way harbor masters on 11 other islands had looked at him, the particular expression of someone holding a door they cannot lock. "Council sits tomorrow," she said. "You'll wait." "I'll wait." He set the transit case on a bollard and stood where the dock met the quay, cataloging without appearing to catalog. The stone was good, volcanic, dense, well laid, but the waterline stain ran 2 hands higher than the engineering would suggest. The dock had been built for a harbor that sat lower. Either the water had risen or the land had dropped, and neither answer was routine. A fisherman on the quay worked a torn net across his knees, fingers moving in the automatic rhythm of a man who'd done this since boyhood. Weathered, brown, unhurried, shoulders that knew weight. He hadn't looked up when the Hershey vessel made harbor. Hadn't looked up when the gangplank dropped. But his hands had slowed for exactly 3 stitches when Vess's boots hit the dock, then resumed. Vess noted him. He'd need local contacts, men who knew the coastline with their bodies, not their instruments. The fisherman nodded off a repair and finally raised his head. His eyes moved past Vess to the transit case, to the bureau stamp embossed in the leather, and something in his expression closed like a door latch dropping. Her father's charts were already on the kitchen table. Kay stood in the doorway, salt-crusted and sun-raw, her field satchel still strapped across her chest. Lyra had weighted the corners with clay cups and was running one finger along the eastern terrace profile. Kay's fresh measurements laid beside the old ink, like an accusation. "Worse than his," Lyra said, not looking up. "I know." Her mother's finger stopped at Station 3. The octopus gall ink had faded to rust where her father had marked the terrace setback 11 years ago. Kay's graphite figure sat 4 meters closer to the volcano's flank. "Are you eating enough up on those headlands? Is the council discussing Hershey involvement?" The warmth left Lyra's hand before it left her voice. She set the chart down, carefully the way she set down anything that could tear, and straightened. The kitchen smelled of dried thyme and lamp oil. A pot of something lentil dark cooled on the stove, untouched. "They sent an assessor. He arrived today." Kay's satchel strap cut into her shoulder. She didn't adjust it. "Before my survey is finished," Lyra moved to the stove, lifted the pot lid, set it back. The gesture was not about food. It was about having something to do with her hands while she chose which question to answer. She chose neither. "I need your numbers to be unimpeachable." She turned, and her eyes held the same expression she'd worn the night she'd struck through her own soil projection in front of the council, a precision that cost her something to maintain. Whatever his say. Kay heard the words her mother had not spoken. The council hadn't discussed Hershey involvement because the involvement was already here, already authorized, already walking Mara's dock counting mooring points, with an eye trained on 11 other islands that had been counted before. The question wasn't whether Hersh had been invited. The question was who had done the inviting, and the silence filling the space between the lentils and the charts, and her mother's turned back answered nothing at all. Hershey boots on Maran's scree. Kay heard the difference before she saw him. She looked up from the transit. The council elder who'd walked Vess up the ridge was already retreating downhill, duty discharged. The bureau man was younger than she'd expected, leaner. His transit case hung from his left shoulder like something he'd been born carrying. She stood, wiped chain grease on her trousers, extended her hand. His grip was dry, calibrated, the handshake of a man who'd offered it on 11 docks. Something moved through the contact that had nothing to do with pressure. A charge, subsurface, like the hum she'd felt at Station 4. She released a half-second early. His fingers stayed open a half-second after hers withdrew. Neither mentioned it. "Bureau tide tables," he said. "Standardized erosion metrics going back 40 years. Yours if useful. Local ground truth. Baseline measurements across every station, a decade's worth. Generous. Practical." Wind pressed her father's charts against the beach stones, holding them flat. Vess's eyes tracked the movement, instruments cataloged, condition assessed, all without seeming to look. She recognized the habit. She did it herself. "I'd like to see the baseline data, cross-reference against bureau projections." She slid the southern headlands chart across the flat rock. He caught the edge before the wind lifted it, weighted it with his case. His gaze moved down the columns, station numbers, recession figures, tide corrections, with the fluency of someone who read numbers the way fishermen read current. Then his hand stopped. Not on the figures, on the header, the surveyor's name written in octopus gall ink in handwriting that wasn't hers. The pause lasted less than a breath. When he looked up, his face was professionally open, professionally curious. "Instrument calibration," he said. "What's the margin on these baselines?" Too smooth. The question shaped too precisely. A door swung shut over whatever had opened behind his eyes. Kay was already answering. Tide corrections, seasonal variance, pin set methodology. The words came automatically because they were hers, because this was her work. She had not noticed the pause at all, or had noticed it and filed it in the same margin where she copied her father's unexplained symbols. The 6th station broke the pattern. 5 stations of professional fluency, Vess matching her pace along the crumbling eastern trail, his bureau figures open in one hand, her father's chart book in the other. He'd asked about substrate composition at Station 2 with the specificity of someone who'd read the geological literature, not just the summary briefs. Drainage patterns at 3. Seasonal wave energy at 4, and he'd corrected her estimate of winter storm frequency against bureau records from 11 other islands, and he'd been right. She'd caught herself explaining the lateral shear mechanics of volcanic tuff erosion in detail she'd never offered a Hershey official, detail that lived in her hands, in the way she pressed her thumb against the cliff face to feel the grain separating. And she'd kept explaining because he was listening the way surveyors listen, not the way diplomats pretend to. At Station 6, she stopped at the cliff edge. The wind pulled her braids sideways. Below, the sea worked at the rock with the patience of something that had already won. My father measured this face at 62 meters. She tapped the figure in the chart book. Octopus gall ink faded to the color of old blood. I measured it at 31 last week. Half. Gone. Vess wrote the number in his own margin. No intake of breath. No practiced diplomatic grimace. No murmur about difficult realities or challenging data points. The phrases she'd learned to translate as we've already decided, and this is the noise we make while pretending we haven't. He wrote 31. He underlined it. He moved to the next column. She waited. The wind filled the silence between them. A gull screamed somewhere below the cliff line, and the sound came back wrong off the diminished rock face. Too close, the echo arriving a half-second sooner than it should have from a wall that used to be twice as far away. Every Hershey official she'd ever briefed had given her the nod. The nod meant the number had been received and would be translated into someone else's language for someone else's purpose. Vess hadn't given her the nod. He'd just written the number like it was true. Kay's handwriting made it worse. Lyra had run the numbers herself. Midnight calculations, cross-referenced yields, the terrace data the Agricultural Committee had sat on for months. She knew the eastern profile before Kay walked the stations. She knew the southern headlands would be worse. She had known, in the way a woman knows the shape of a wound before the bandage comes off, that her daughter's measurements would confirm what the sea had been saying for years. But knowing and seeing were different animals. She turned the pages under the oil lamp. Station 1. Her husband's figures in faded octopus gall ink on the left, Kay's fresh entries on the right. Station 2. Station 3. Each pair a before and after that read like an amputation record. What was there? What remains? Kay's notation was cleaner than her father's, more disciplined, but the hand was the same leftward slant on the sevens, the same habit of underlining anomalies twice. Lyra set the eastern profile face down on the table. From beneath a clay bread crock, she pulled the envelope, heavy paper, Hershey watermark, the diplomatic seal she'd broken 6 weeks ago and resealed with candle wax so the edges wouldn't show. Preliminary relocation terms, Island of Mara, unsigned, no named signatory, no bureau stamp, delivered by pouch on a routine trading vessel tucked between tariff notices as though it were ordinary correspondence. The terms offered guaranteed port allocation on Hirsch's western coast, skilled labor placement, provisional housing for up to 400 families, cultural preservation allowances, a phrase she'd stared at until the words lost meaning. Generous. Every clause generous. The kind of generous that meant someone had already decided Mara was finished and was now managing the cost of appearing kind. 6 weeks before the assessor arrived, before Kai's commission, before the council's exhausted silence. Someone had written the ending before the survey began. The chair legs hummed. A low shudder moved through the kitchen floor, subsonic, sourceless, the same tremor the fishermen blamed on deep currents. Lyra pressed her palm flat against the table and held it there, feeling the vibration travel through wood and bone, waiting for the world to stop moving beneath her. The bureau numbers were wrong. Vess knew it before he sat down at the narrow desk the council had provided. Pine, hand-planed, smelling of salt and old varnish. The room was clean, sparse. A single window faced the harbor where the last fishing boats rocked against their moorings in the dark. He'd asked for a lamp. They'd given him 2, plus a clay dish of rendered fish oil he hadn't requested. Maran hospitality. Nothing offered, nothing withheld. He opened his transit case and laid out the assessment forms. Standard Bureau format, 11 columns, pre-printed headers, space for coastal regression figures calibrated to Hershey orbital tide models, and 4 decades of historical regression. The models were elegant. They assumed uniform substrate density, predictable storm frequency, and no anomalous subsurface activity. They had been accurate enough on Pelos, on Vaith, on 9 other islands, where accurate enough was all anyone needed to justify whatever decision had already been made. He entered Kay's station data first. Eastern Escarpment, stations 1 through 6. Her numbers were meticulous. Instrument calibration noted, tide state recorded, measurement repeated 3 times at each pin. Professional. Better than professional, the kind of work that left no room for reinterpretation. Then the Bureau projections. 12 to 15 years of habitable coastline. Her father's measurements, a decade old, extrapolated forward. 6. Her current figures, extrapolated less. He set down the pen. The gap between the columns was not a rounding error. It was not a difference in methodology. It was 2 different answers to the question of whether an island full of people had a generation or half of one. Bureau projections didn't use local ground truth. Local surveyors were uncertified sources. Protocol was clear. Protocol had been clear on 11 other islands. He picked up the pen, wrote the Bureau numbers into the official report. Clean, defensible, institutional. Then he pulled a blank sheet from beneath the assessment forms, unheadered, unlogged, and wrote hers. The plumb line swung like a pendulum over nothing. Kay knelt at the overhang's lip, feeding cord through her fingers. The same braided hemp her father had used. The same lead weight she'd found in his kit, wrapped in oilcloth and labeled in his hand. Southern stations undercutting measure. The Bureau didn't drop plumb lines. The Bureau measured from above, where the rock still looked like rock. Hold this, she offered the transit rod to Vess without looking back. He took it. She fed more cord. The weight dropped past the cliff face, past the visible erosion line, past the point where sandstone should have met the sea. It kept dropping. She counted the knots, 1 meter, 2, 3 past the surface shelf. The cord went slack. The weight had found air, not stone. A cavity. She pulled it taut again, let it swing, felt for contact. Nothing. The undercutting ran deeper than the overhang was wide. Read the knots, she said. 3.2 meters. His voice was level, but his pencil had stopped. She hauled the line back, hand over hand, and when she passed the coiled cord to him so he could verify the wet mark against the dry, their fingers closed on the same section of hemp, his knuckles against her palm. Neither of them corrected the grip. 4 seconds. She felt his pulse through the braid, or hers. The wind off the headland pressed her shirt flat against her ribs. She pulled the measurement free. He wrote the number. The surface recession here reads 0.5 meter since last season, she said. Your Bureau models would call that moderate. They would. We're standing on 3 meters of nothing. Vess looked at the number in his ledger, looked at the cliff edge 2 strides away. He didn't step back. His pencil found the page again, a second entry below the first in the unlogged column she wasn't supposed to know existed. Behind them, solid ground. Beneath them, a shelf of sandstone with its throat cut, held up by habit and the dry season's mercy. The last pin wouldn't hold. Northwestern point, final station. Kay drove the iron twice into basalt that should have gripped, and twice it skated loose. She knelt and pressed her thumb into the hole. The stone crumbled like chalk beneath a skin of gray. Same as the southern headlands where she'd left Vess 3 days ago, still writing on a shelf undermined by 3 meters of nothing. She'd walked away from that, hadn't looked back to see if he stepped off the edge. Hadn't asked since. She set the pin by hand, shallow, and stretched the chain to her father's reference cairn. He'd stacked 9 stones 11 years ago. 4 remained. She pulled the measurement, wrote it, didn't breathe until the number was down. Then she unrolled every chart she owned across the flat rock where she'd worked all week. Her father's southern profiles in octopus gall ink, her eastern escarpment stations, the Bureau's 40-year regression tables Vess had traded her on the second morning. She weighted corners with survey pins, the lead plumb bob, a fist of the basalt that had disintegrated under her iron. She stood back. The composite didn't argue. It screamed. Her father's figures, the ones that had run ahead of every official Moran record, the ones that made him prophet or liar depending on which elder you asked, were now the most conservative line on the chart. Her own eastern escarpment readings from 6 days ago already lagged behind this afternoon's northwestern numbers. The acceleration wasn't linear. She'd plotted the curve 3 times. It steepened with each station each day, as though the island were not eroding but dissolving, the process feeding itself. She inked today's date in the margin. Beneath it, one word: why. Wind shifted. Pine smoke and lamp oil carried from across the ridge, Vess's window still lit. His bureau baselines were locked in that stamped transit case. Without them, her curve was local, unprovable, dismissible. She rolled the charts, cinched her satchel, and started walking toward the light. Downhill, across open ground, where anyone on the ridge could watch a Maran surveyor carry her island's death sentence to a Hershey assessor's door.
On her map, a story from the Saltscar universe. Written by Julia L. Vale, produced by Muck Neon. New chapters every Saturday. Follow the Saltscar social accounts for daily reels.